Welcome back. This is week 2, lecture 1, the late medieval crisis, or the crisis of the later Middle Ages, as it's called here. And this lecture follows up very nicely from the previous lecture on the basic structures of Christendom, because in that lecture I talked about how there were fissures and cracks within this idealized structure and system of Christendom as a legal ideal, as an ideology, with the three orders, the other aspects that I talked about that seemed in this period of the later Middle Ages began to make themselves manifest as never before. It's not that people weren't aware of some of the tensions, such as the tensions between the imperial cities or the communes and the feudal structure, between the Pope and the Emperor, between princes and the Emperor. That certainly was the case. But in the later Middle Ages, again, they came to the fore, so to speak. They could no longer be ignored. Now, the term crisis, which I think I talked about a little bit, is overused. It is often trivialized because it's overused, like the word love. I love chocolate. I love that. I love so and so. That's not really what love is. That's just like. And somewhere crisis is the same way in that we use it for such common things sometimes, or common problems. Almost any kind of problem we have all of a sudden is a crisis. As I'm using the term, what it means is the basic assumptions, even unconscious assumptions of how the world works, are no longer working. What do we do? Now, the readings for this week are the introduction in chapter 1 and 2 of the textbook, and then the introduction in chapter 1 of my book, Luther and the Reformation of the Later Middle Ages. And they give you an overview of this period. And in my book, I give you an overview of why I refer to this period as the Reformation of the Later Middle Ages. It goes beyond the chronological development that we're going to be looking at in this lecture. This is just the first lecture on this period of the late medieval crisis, which then necessitated efforts to bring about a reformation. Because there's a crisis, what do we do about it? We have to do something. And only a full reformation in head and members, meaning leadership, the Pope, the Emperor, all the way down to the local level, can address these problems. A full reformation of society. And we'll talk more about that as we go through these next several lectures. We'll be talking about these same things. Now, you'll see, if you are paying close attention to the readings, that there's a different representation or portrayal or interpretation, however you want to call it, between what Lindbergh argues in terms of the late medieval developments and what I argue in my book. In terms of your text analyses, in terms of your final exam, in terms of your understanding, for the purposes of this course, you should follow what I have to say. I'm not saying I have the last word about it, but this is my area of specialty and expertise. This is nothing against Lindbergh. And so if you're writing about it, make sure that you at least are aware of that discrepancy. And if you want to argue that Lindbergh is more accurate than I am, you're welcome to do that. But you'll have to prove your case. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to follow Lindbergh and forget about what Sack has to say. So I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions about that, please just ask. But those readings are supposed to give you, or are intended to give you, kind of the structure for looking at some more particular developments, beginning in this lecture and then for the next several lectures, over what was this period of crisis / reformation all about. Because in some ways, the crisis was the problem, and reformation was the answer. These calls for reformation were the answers. And as we'll see later on, and as I argue in my book, the Reformation of the later Middle Ages failed. But we'll get there when we get there in terms of conceptually putting it all together. But here, this lecture begins with four developments, especially with three major ones, and then kind of an ongoing issue that became increasingly apparent were problematic as we moved from the what's called the High Middle Ages up until from about the year 1000 until about approximately 1300 into the later Middle Ages from approximately 1300 to at some endpoint when early modern Europe emerges. Now, I'll get to that latter part later in the course, but here we're looking at this very beginning. And what we see is an outbreak, so to speak, of famine, plague, war, and poverty. Poverty was always there. And I'll be addressing that. In some ways, that was the least dramatic in terms of being seen as a crisis or a problem. But famine, plague, and war were. Now, there's always been war as well. I'll be talking about that in a moment shortly, too. But if you know the Christian tradition, if you've read the last book in the Christian scriptures, in the canonical scriptures in the Christian Bible, which is called Revelations or the Apocalypse, we'll talk about those terms as well. You know that these are the four riders or the four horses of the apocalypse. Four riders of the apocalypse, four horses of the apocalypse, which actually I chose as the cover of my book, which I don't think came through in the PDF file of the proofs that I gave you there. So I just want to show it to you briefly here, because this is a woodcut by Albrecht Dürer, who is a close associate of Luther and also did a lot of woodcuts dealing with the Reformation. But here you can see the four horses of the apocalypse, sort of there anyway, in Dürer's representation. And that is then famine, plague. Oops, I'm dropping stuff on my desk here. Famine, plague, war, and poverty, even though not necessarily in that order. That's the order I'm going to be treating them here. So with that as the introduction to this lecture, we can move right along. And again, I will try not to cut myself off again and see how that goes. So bear with me. Wish me luck. And I hope you get something out of this lecture as we go through it. Alrighty. First, then slide after the opening slide, which is the first topic is famine. And you'll see up there the Great Northern Famine, 1317 to 1322. Now, famine, and what makes this famine, this Great Northern Famine, as it's so-called, different from previous quote-unquote famines, was the severity of it. We've never experienced famine. Now, I'm making an assumption here. But I would be willing to bet that none of us, meaning none of you registered in this course watching this video, nor myself, I certainly haven't ever experienced famine. Period of hunger, very likely, or very possible. Even what's called, let's say, food insecurity. That's what it's called today here, I think, food insecurity. It's a serious, serious problem. And I'm not meaning to undermine that. But that is not the same as famine. Famine occurs when significant numbers of the population die because of hunger. Famine is what happens, over there in third world countries that we see, and you know what I'm talking about. It's pathetic and it's horrible. And we see pictures every once in a while, National Geographic. It's rarely covered in the news because it's there and it's real and it's absolutely horrific. Real famine, not just periods of hunger or food insecurity. That's very different. And a real famine hit in Europe beginning in 1317. How do we know this? We know this from the evidence, from written sources and documents that talked about it. And then also from the analysis, because of these documents talking about this famine and how horrible it was, scholars started saying we should see if we can actually determine um, based on the physical evidence, if there's any evidence of it. And so it's called endocrinology, looking at tree rings, where you can see levels of rainfall and so. And based on, I don't understand it really how it works, but there you go. Scholars have argued that based on the analysis of tree rings in Northern Europe, we can determine that there was this period, approximately a 5-year period, where there was extraordinary rain. Wait a minute, this is Northern Europe. Wasn't there always rain? Yes, but not like this. I grew up on a farm in Central California. Raisins and walnuts. And raisins, or grapes that we made into raisins. And you may not know this, maybe you do, but the way you make raisins from grapes, there's a couple different ways, but the primary way, the raisins that you buy in the store, not the golden ones, those are different, but the black raisins of various types, those are all dried in the sun. So the grapes are picked, they're put on paper trays, within you have 2 rows, and the paper trays filled with the grapes, and then the sun dries them. You have to turn them over once, dries the other side, and you pick them up, and you kind of wash them off and process them, and that becomes raisins. It happened, I think, 3 times growing up that we ended up losing our crop. Why? Because of rain. Because when the grapes are on the trays, when they've all been picked and are on the trays drying, and you get a rainstorm, it's a problem. A little bit of rain, you can survive, get by, not a big problem. But if you get more than just a little bit of rain, it's going to start causing mildew, and it's going to rot, and then you can't sell rotten, half-dried raisins. There's a helpless feeling looking out there and seeing it's actually just water flowing down the rows of grapes where there should be paper trays of our crop. Now, in today's society, if you lose your crop 1 year, it's not good. It's never good. But you can kind of survive. There are means of making it work. And that first time that it happened, it was the first time that it was that widespread of a crop failure due to rain with the grapes and the raisins. And so, of course, other people, entrepreneurs, insurance companies saw an opportunity, and they developed something called rain insurance, whereby farmers could purchase rain insurance in case their crops were wiped out by the weather and by the rain. And so we did that from that point on. But it happened 2 other times. Now, of course, the rain insurance didn't cover what it would have been if we could have sold the fruit, as we usually did. Actually, this is sun-made raisins, if you know anything about sun-made raisins. My dad was on the board for a number of years of sun-made raisins, which is actually a co-op run by farmers. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is that it was an industry problem. And so the industry, and so it was seen that there was this need for insurance. They would at least cover some of the costs if you had rain insurance. And it didn't happen back-to-back years. It happened 1 year, and a couple of years later it happened again, and a couple of years later it happened again, and then it didn't happen anymore. Weather patterns, who knows what. But if you lose your crop, and if your own food supply is based on what you grow, and you lose it, not only do you lose monetarily, but you lose food. And if it happens the next year, and then the next year, and then the next year, you can see all of a sudden, it's to be the point that there's no food. It's not just a matter of going out of business, which is what, the threat, the worry faced us, but you could survive, you could get by, and we did. But we never worried about food. Never got to that point. But here in Europe, there was the number of years from approximately 1315 or so, where there were extraordinary rain years that destroyed the crops. And people, starting in 1317, started to starve. It's horrific. I can't think of, well, there could be other worse ways to die, perhaps, but it must be one of the very worst. Starving to death must be one of the worst ways to die that I can think of. It was so bad that there were stories told, documented in text, documents that have survived, of cannibalism. I think, ooh, it's gross. Isn't it gross? Yeah, it's gross. Now, we don't have any way of verifying if people in Northern Europe were eating other people. But before you start thinking that's just gross, think of the situation. I don't know if any of you have heard the stories about the Donner Party in California. That was an issue of cannibalism. If you are a parent and you have a spouse and a couple of kids, let's say your spouse dies of starvation, you know you don't have more than a day or two left, maybe. Your kids could go at any moment. What do you do? Because all of a sudden, here is flesh, there's meat. It's a horrible, horrible situation to be in. It's excruciating even to think about it, much less to actually face it. But that's what we're talking about. We're not saying, oh, good, mommy tastes so great, it tastes like chicken. That's not what we're talking about at all. Is that utter desperation, a level of human panic and need that we can't really fathom, I don't think. That's how severe it was. Now, this famine didn't hit all throughout Europe. It hit in Northern Europe. So if you're in Italy, if you're in Spain, you were relatively okay. If you were in southern France, you were probably fine. If you were in northern Germany into Scandinavia, if you were maybe in parts of England, northern France, it was horrific. Horrific. And it caused people to think, why? Why was this happening? Now, let's say positive thing about famine is if you survive. Recovery is not all that difficult. You were, let's say, on the verge of starvation. Forget about cannibalism, but you're on the verge of starvation. And all of a sudden, food becomes available again. Now, you can't all of a sudden gorge yourself. You'll make yourself sick and you might die from that. But if you survive, you can recover. And if you're an adult, you can cover pretty well without any major long-term consequences if it's a short period of starvation and famine. But think about the children who survived. If you were a year old in 1317, and if somehow you survived, by 1322, you'd have been 6. Think about human development. How do humans develop between the ages of 1 and 6, or newborn and 5, or 8 and 13? There are these periods of human development and growth in childhood that are so significant that you don't ever get back. That does have long-term impact and effect. And if you were 2 years old in 1317, and you survived the famine somehow, in 1322, you would have been, then, what did I say, 2 years old? You'd be 7 years old, 5 years. And in 1342, you'd be 27 years old. But in a weakened state. That is just about when another major cataclysmic event hit Europe, and this time all of Europe, namely the plague. And you see the slide, the plague. 1347 to 1350. Now, there have been diseases before, but never like this. There was an earlier plague in the 6th century called Justinian's plague. It was it was bad. It was severe. It was bad. But it was way, way in the past, 800 years ago. Not a lot of documentation left about it, and certainly not within the memory. It's been estimated that at least a third of the population of Europe died between 1347 and 1350. And in some places, such as the city of Florence for one, the death toll was as high as 80% of the population. We talk about COVID. We talk about the Spanish flu. We used to talk about AIDS. None of those ever got near killing off a third of the population. That's the significance of this impact. That's aggregate European-wide within Christendom. Now, one little pet peeve of mine is don't ever refer to the plague as the Black Plague. You can refer to it as the Black Death because that is how it became known. But don't refer it to it as the Black Plague. There's no such thing. Black Death or plague. Now, what was the plague? It's a disease. It still is around. Every once in a while you hear of cases of plague popping up. There are three basic forms of plague: bubonic plague, pneumonic plague, and septicemic plague. They hit different parts of the body. Bubonic plague hits the lymph nodes, the lymph gland system, the lymphic system. It's called bubonic because it would produce buboes, like big ulcers on your bodies that would then break and be discolored. It was, in some ways, the best form to get because it would take a few days to die. Maybe it was the worst form to get. Pneumonic plague affected the lungs. And if you got pneumonic plague, you could be dead in a few hours, certainly within the day. Septicemic plague affected the bloodstream and the circulatory system. And that too caused a discoloration. That's where we get the Black Death term, from the septicemic and the bubonic plague. Now, often they said, yeah, it was carried by rats. Well, yes and no. The bacillus, as it's officially determined what a plague is, was found in the regurgitated saliva of fleas. The fleas were living on the rats, kind of gnawing on the rats and puking, and that produced the emergence of this Bacillus pestis, which is a Latin term for a pestis. It's also known as the pest. And was transported through trade. It was in the East. Earliest evidence we have of it reaching "quote unquote" the West was 1347 in the ports of Genoa, and oh gosh, I can't believe Vienna, Genoa, not Vienna. Eric used to it. Venice and Genoa, the trading posts in northern Italy, and from there it spread. It was in England by 1349. By 1350, it's "quote unquote" over. And by 1350, at least a third, as I just said, of the population had died from plague. Now, scholars also argue this. That seems like a lot, really, a whole lot of death just for the plague. Is that really what was going on? Were other things and factors involved? And I would say almost certainly there were other diseases that contributed to the death rate besides just the plague, as if that wasn't bad enough. How so? How did that work? Well, here's an example. Um, at the time, um, infectious diseases were known, but not the way they spread. The medical knowledge, compared to what we know today, compared to what was known even 100 years ago, in the 14th century, was very minimal. They knew about infection, but they didn't really understand what caused the spread. If you're in a house, the family, extended family, and someone dies in your house with the plague, they come home, they get the plague. Oh, you take care of them, they're sick, and then they die. You go out and bury them, or you go to a priest, they bury them. And the next day, the priest is dead, and you're dead. And someone else in your household may be dead. All of a sudden, who's going to bury you? It became pretty clear early on that if you were to take care of the dead who had died from plague, you were highly likely to get it. Best thing to do is get away from anybody that has plague. There were quarantines, not in those terms, but that was the idea. Of course, they didn't realize that quarantining people in a closed space was not always the best way to prevent spread. The idea was we have to keep the air out because it must be traveling by air. So if we go into a locked, enclosed room, we'll be safe. And obviously that wasn't the case. But you see it that it spreads. You don't want to bury somebody. So there are accounts, especially in Florence, as I mentioned, where we have very good literary textual accounts of what was going on, of dead bodies just being kind of somehow moved into the street. No one wants to go near them, understandably. So if you have a bunch of plague-infested, rotting bodies, that's going to lead to all kinds of other diseases that are also as deadly. There was this kind of combination of infectious diseases that go under the umbrella name the plague that contributed to the high death rate. But that, in some ways, is not all that important, at least in my mind. It could be for the history of medicine, history of treatments, all those kinds of things. It's very important. But no one questioned that the plague was the major factor, and then the other diseases, whatever they might have been, certainly contributed to it. But we don't have records identifying, oh, Bob died not of plague, but of typhoid. Maybe he got plague too, but cause of death was typhoid. We don't have those kinds of records at the time. It's plague, and people are terrified. Terrified. Think of the effects on society. And this is from Italy through England. Remember the lockdowns and COVID. Most of you, I don't know all of your ages, but unless you're more or less my age, give or take a number of years, you don't remember the first kind of outbreak, at least awareness of the outbreak of AIDS. It was scary because at first no one really knew how you got it or how to prevent getting it. It caused problems, social problems, political problems, until it was then understood to some degree. Vaccines were created that helped control it. I mean, it's not, AIDS is not a non potentially deadly disease. It still can be, but not like it was in the late 70s, early 80s, where it's basically a death sentence. And that was fearful. And still, AIDS didn't kill anywhere near the number population or percentage of population that the plague did. So just try to imagine the impact on society. such death. And this is not that long after the famine. The people in Northern Europe still remembered very clearly. And that trauma of the famine was simply then compounded by the trauma of the plague. And people were asking why. They have up there seeking the causes. There were two primary answers to the causes. One was the rise in anti-Semitism. I think I mentioned that by the year 1000 or so, this is in previous lecture, everyone in Europe was Christian except for the Jews. And there had been tensions with the Jews all along. I think I mentioned too about the Crusades and the first big outbreak of anti-Semitism in the West, within Christendom, was in the context of the Crusades. It kind of dies down. There were, again, there were waves of anti-Semitism, but the plague all of a sudden led to a boom, big spike in anti-Semitism. Why? Someone must be responsible. Someone must be responsible. The Jews. They've always hated Christians. They've been trying to get rid of Christians ever since they got rid of Christ. They are doing it. They are killing us. Well, how are they doing it? We don't see Jews going out and, dropping poison in Christian food or anything, or going out actively trying to cough on people. The water, the wells. They were poisoning the wells. Now, this is, let's say, an early example of a conspiracy theory that most people at the time did not take seriously because it was so ridiculous. But it was out there. Why was it ridiculous? Because it was clear the Jews were dying just as much as Christians were. So the idea that the Jews would have been so stupid to poison the wells and kill themselves as well was rather, come on, there has to be other causes. A disaster of this proportion, though. Plague, pest, plague. Where do we know it from? We know it from the Bible. The plagues that God sent to Egypt to have the Israelites, for the Pharaoh to let the Israelites leave and go. And the plagues were part of that. And this was an event of biblical proportions. God is punishing us. Why? Why is God punishing us? It must because the failure of the priests. The damn priests are not doing their job. They're letting us off too easy. We have not sufficiently atoned for our sins, and this is God's way of making us pay for that. Now, I mentioned briefly in the last lecture the rise of the mendicants, how that caused tensions with the parish clergy. Why is that? Think about this: a town. You have a town, parish church, or a manor even. It's the same kind of a town is just like a manor writ large in some ways, but with artisans and stuff in the feudal system. You have the parish church with a secular priest in charge of the parish church who, preaches on Sundays and weekdays, who performs the sacraments, who performs the baptisms and the marriages and the last rites and the confirmations, and buries people in the church, everything else. Be very, very busy to be a parish priest. If your parish was sufficiently large, has to listen to all the confessions. And then the mendicants come to town. Let's say the Franciscans will move in and build a cloister. And they too are involved in caring for the people, pastoral care. We'll be talking more about this later in later lectures. And they too can hear confessions, because the mendicants, unlike the monks out in the wilderness, were all priests. So all of a sudden, you have an abundance of priests, and their whole point is to win souls. And we'll talk more about the economic, almost business transactional side of the late medieval theological religious economy in a subsequent lecture. But we can see it here because it's like, okay, I'm also better trained than the parish clergy if I'm a Franciscan or Dominican. Usually, having come from the universities, we'll talk more about the universities too in a later lecture. Um, so I have a better education. I understand how things work more and more theologically savvy and sophisticated. And I know that, God is God. God is omnipotent. Do we need to do penance? Oh, yes. But it's more of a token. So if somebody goes and, let's say you meet up at the local pub and a buddy of yours is shaking their head. And yes, I'm sorry, this isn't a male example. But you can come up with, female or other gendered examples as well. It works, whatever. You're shaking your head. He's shaking his head. I say, well, what's wrong with you? No, I just went to confession. Damn it. I have a pretty shitty penance I got to do. Really, what is it? I have to say 100 Pater Nosters. I have to contribute at least $50 to the building of the new altar in the church, in the new church. If I wasn't going to do that, I was going to have to go on a pilgrimage. Whoa, that's pretty hefty. What did you do? So I'm not going to talk about what I did, but anyway, that was the penance I got for it. And I said, well, why don't you try going to the Franciscans? I've heard that they often get a better deal. Was really, yeah, worth a shot. Okay, so goes off to the Franciscans. Goes into the confessional, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. What is my sin? Your sin, my son. Blah 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 blah. Oh, okay. Let's say it's I coveted my neighbor's cow. Thou shalt not covet. I coveted my neighbor's cow. Oh, that's one of the big commandments. Yeah. Well, Franciscan would say, did you do anything with the cow? What? No. I thought about it. So you didn't do anything at all with the cow. You didn't steal the cow. You didn't, have sex with the cow. You didn't kidnap the cow. No, no, Father. No, 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 no. So, geez, there's nothing, no real problem there. Say, 10 Hail Marys, 5 Paternosters, and you're good to go. Really? Yeah. No, you shouldn't do it. I mean, it's a temptation. Everybody's tempted. Great. So you come back and you meet up, with your buddy, or meets up with his friend, and meets up with you in the bar and says, yep, that's fantastic. The Franciscans, I just got off for, 10 Hail Marys and 5 Paternosters, and I'm good to go. Great. People started leaving the parish church and going to the mendicant churches. That meant too, where you're going to have your, wife buried or your kids buried if they die. Oh, I want to see if the Franciscans can do it. Great. Well, let's say your spouse dies. You go to your parish priest and says, Father, Mary died. I get a male. Okay, fine. I'm male. I'm not coming at it from this example. But anyway, and it was at the time women couldn't do this anyway. So, meaning they couldn't go to a priest and establish endow a mass. Unless you're a noble woman. Anyway, so you go to your priest and say, Father, Mary has died. Oh, I'm so sorry. Will you bury her here, Father? Of course I will. And could you say masses for her soul, at least once a year? I said, oh, I don't know, man. That's pretty. My calendar is pretty full. I'll see if I can work it in. Go to the Franciscans. Of course, we can say one every day for her if you want. We have, 23 priests here. Great. You say, okay, what's going on here? It's a loss of income. If people start attending a Franciscan or then a Dominican or an Augustinian church, and they all kind of started going to the cities and towns, that was their purpose. That was their charge. Go minister to the people. They'd also compete with each other. So people are leaving the parish church. What do you do on Sunday if you've never been to a Christian worship service? I'll fill you in. But almost in any Christian worship service I've been to, there is at some point something called the collection or the offertory, where you give money for the support of the church and the parish, and the community. But if you're not going to the parish church, you're giving your money to the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Augustinians. It's an economic problem, a financial problem, and the parish clergy are losing out and they're going berserk. They're angry at these damn mendicants. So there's tension there. And then the plague hits. People are feeling maybe our parish clergy, priest was right. Maybe this easy way out, this easy penance is completely insufficient. And it's those damn priests. Or maybe they included the parish priest too, because it wasn't working. They're not doing their job, and because of that, God is punishing us with the plague. And if they won't impose proper penance, we need to do that ourselves. Groups started to emerge, known as the flagellants. Not flagellants, but not flatulence, but flagellants, who would be whipping themselves. They're also called groups of penitents. And they would go from city to city, proclaiming the need to do penance because the priests are failing. Now, their critique against the priests, both the parish priests and the mendicant priests, was not a lack of belief. It came from a real sense of piety and, let's say, even super belief in some ways. But it still was anti-clerical. Criticizing the clergy is anti-clericalism. That's an important term. And when clergy are criticizing the clergy, that's clerical anti-clericalism. And so that the parish priest criticizing the mendicants is clerical anti-clericalism. But the common people criticizing the priests as such, and there's various types of anti-clericalism, was signified an uptick in anti-clericalism and critiques against the clergy. The priests are not doing their job. They're pretty worthless. They don't know what they're doing, which is not a move away from the church, but a desire to get it all right. And this idea that we then have to take over what our priests are supposed to be doing. So we have to impose penance on ourselves. And whipping and flagellating ourselves is a good way to do it. And going around and telling other people to do it too is a help, because this is not just us, this is everywhere. Now, the church, the hierarchy, the Pope, and the bishops condemned the flagellants. No. Now, you can see why. Because of the anti-clerical stance they were taking. To say the clergy aren't doing their jobs. Of course they are, even if they're not. But the idea was there. What to do about the plague, how to explain it. We have rising anti-Semitism, we have a rise in anti-clericalism. The thing is, by 1350, the plague had kind of subsided. And usually, the accounts of the Black Death, that's what it's referred to, the Black Death, this period 1347 to 1350. But then we stop there, we go on, and we forget about it. But the plague was also endemic in that it kept coming back periodically. Not nearly to the level that it was at 1347 to 1350. Not at all, but still a significant problem. So if we have 1347, then it would fall away, then it would come back, and come back, and come back, and come. The last outbreak was in Marseille in 1714, I think it was. Luther talks about the plague. A letter of a Lutheran pastor outside of Wittenberg writes to him. This is, what should I do? Should I flee? Where a lot of people are trying to leave the city and get away from the plague, or should I stay? The plague remained an issue, even if it wasn't as intense and traumatic and overwhelming as it was in this first period of 1347 to 1350. You don't think it just disappeared? So we have famine, we have plague, then we have, the next one is war. There'd always been war, and Christians were fighting Christians, Christian princes were fighting Christian princes, and always had. If you want a fantastic read in terms of early medieval Frankish society, good Christian Frankish values, read Gregory of Tours, The History of the Franks, talking about 6th century Frankish peoples who are Christian, good Christian people. Gregory of Tours is a bishop. And they're as brutal and bloodthirsty as they possibly can be. War is a constant of human culture. What to do about it? Will we ever get beyond that? That's a good question. I doubt it, as long as we remain humans. But that's a whole another story. The 100 Years' War begins in 1336, right between the end of the famine and the beginning of the plague. Now, France and England, which is the 100 Years' War, starts with the Battle of Crécy, 1336, is somewhat a misnomer. Because it's not like France and England fought continuously for 100 years. There is off and on battles, but they had been fighting off and on since the 12th century at least. But some of this period of 1336 to about 1415 or so, Joan of Arc, if you've heard that at the end, is referred to as the 100 Years' War. A more consistent fighting during this period. What did the soldiers do? Talk about France and England, you invade, you go through towns. What do soldiers do when they go through towns? They rape, pillage, and plunder. Always have, probably always will. And this is just normal war. I'm not talking about the atrocities, if that makes sense. It's a problem. Armies didn't target civilians, but they certainly went through towns. They had to be housed and all those things. So when you're at more or less consistent, I'm not going to say constant, but consistent war, it's a state of emergency. And two, I have it there on the slide, what is it? Crusades and heresy? Yeah. Even though the Crusades technically were kind of ended by the end of the 13th century, the 8th Crusade, technically, the concept remained, and popes started calling for crusades against heresies, groups of heretics, and including against heretical emperors or princes. So this idea of crusade and going on a holy war continued. And there were actual battles between popes and princes. I'll talk more about this next lecture, I think it is. But it was shocking to see that the King of France, Philip IV, sent troops to capture Pope Boniface VIII. Ooh, why do you do that? Yeah, and that's a conflict I'll be talking about again, I think, next lecture or so. John the 22nd, Pope John the 22nd, the early in the 1320s, 1330s. It's been estimated that he spent over 2/3 of his income on troops, on mercenaries to fight the Emperor Louis of Bavaria. So there's war going on. And what happens in war? People die. What happens in plague? People die. What happened with the famine? People die. In the context, too, of an ongoing problem with poverty. And I said, poverty, was not as um, virulent as the plague, the war, and famine. Or maybe it was more so, just at a lower level, because the majority of the population in Europe had been poor and was still poor. We begin to see, though, in the 14th century, a growing wealth gap. Not that there ever wasn't before. There always was between the poor and the wealthy, the nobles and the commoner and the peasantry. And then we have the issue of the merchants and the rising merchants and bankers who are getting very, very wealthy. And in some ways, the poor people are losing out and becoming poorer. And lower level nobility are losing out to the upper nobility. So what do? They start um, passing the buck, so to speak, on the peasantry, and they begin restricting peasant rights. I think I may have mentioned this last lecture too, but it comes in here too, because they're feeling the squeeze economically, the lower nobility, and they then say, okay, well, we have to squeeze it out of our peasants. This begins this period of a series of peasant uprisings, peasant rebellions from the mid 14th century on through the 15th and on into the 16th century. Of peasants saying, we can't live. And our traditional rights of fishing in the streams, of hunting in the forest, of gathering firewood, you are restricting those or making us pay for it extra? You're sucking us dry. We can't live and can't survive. We will starve to death. Well, famine. So that sense of poverty was there. Meanwhile, there was an outbreak of what's called the poverty controversy in the mid 14th century between the mendicants and the parish clergy. The idea for Francis, so it all started, was that to be poor, his phrase was, I'm willing to be poor, following the naked and poor Christ. Because in the course of the 12th on into the 13th century, the church as an institution, the hierarchy, the bishops, the archbishops, the papacy was becoming very wealthy. And there began to be a lot of critiques against the institutional church already there in the late 12th on into the 13th century. The Poor of Lyon, the Waldensi, and several other groups that were deemed heretical were criticizing the institutional church by saying, damn it, Jesus was a poor itinerant preacher. You people are feeding your bellies and are getting rich. You are not truly Christian. You don't represent Christ. That was a conflict and a problem because on the one hand, it's like, yeah, Jesus of Nazareth, what we can tell, wasn't wealthy. But they were condemned, those groups. Francis comes along and wants to pursue a life of poverty, but in obedience with the Pope. The Pope says, here's an opportunity, and accepts Francis and gives him the charge of preaching. And Francis's idea was that then when he got followers, and they became an order of friars preachers, or OFM, fratres minores in Latin, or the fratres, ordo fratrum minorum, in the plural. We would own nothing because Christ owned nothing. Anything that we might seem to own, like our habits, what we wear, or cloisters that we build and everything, the church will actually own. We will just use them. It was called a poor use, or an usus fructus. We use these things, we don't own them. Now, that was going to be a major issue later on, as we'll see also in the 14th century. I just wanted to bring that up here. I'll come back to it because for the population, you mendicant monks are claiming to be poor. You freaking hypocrites. Now, some of them really were poor. They would have to beg for their food and everything else. But how can you say that when, we're starving? That image of the fat friar Tuck. There were those, but that is more a caricature based on this tension. Claiming to be poor, we're really poor. And we are really poor, which leads to what? More anti-clericalism. What does this all end up as and result in? What does it lead to? It leads to an upsurge in apocalypticism. I already mentioned the four forces of the apocalypse: famine, plague, war, and poverty. That was very well known in the mentality of the times. We begin to see increasing numbers of excellent commentaries on the apocalypse. Biblical scholars, theologians commenting on the apocalypse. How do you explain it? How do you explain the famine when you have cannibalism? How do you explain the level of death of the plague and how it all worked out? How do you explain the constant ongoing war and the increasing problems of poverty? It must be the end of the world. These, after all, are the signs of the times. These are what the horses that God has let out to ride before there were the 9 riders of not Voldemort, of Sauron. The ring went wraiths. With Lord of the Rings, there were the 4 riders of the apocalypse, and they had been let loose. The end of the world is at hand. What do we do? There's only one thing to do, if we have any chance at all, and that's bring about a thorough and complete reformation. And we see increasing calls for reformation, not simply, we should just try to reform ourselves, make ourselves better. No, this is, we need a thorough reformation, a reformatio. Or there's no hope at all. That apocalyptic expectation, there have been waves of apocalypticism around the year 1000. There was kind of an outbreak of apocalyptic expectation. Every now and again, you'll see outbreaks of apocalyptic expectation around the year 2000. There was people saying this is the end of the world. People have been proclaiming the end of the world in the last days and the last judgment coming. Ever since the crucifixion and experienced resurrection of Jesus. Now, the reason I say experience is because it is more or less historically ascertainable that Jesus of Nazareth was indeed probably most likely crucified. We cannot historically validate the resurrection. But anyway, that's another issue. But they've been talking about, Jesus says you will not taste death. This generation won't taste death until I come again to judge the living and the dead. It hasn't happened yet that we know of. How would you live your life? What would you do differently if you fervently believed that the end of the world was imminent? Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but certainly before the end of next year. Could be at any time, but certainly before the end of next year, certainly before the election of 2024. Let's hope the world ends before the election of 2024. Anyway, I'm not supposed to make political comments, so scratch that from the record. My point is, if you believed it, would you live your life doing anything differently? How would it change? Especially if you believe that the result was not simply poof, you're no longer alive, but you're going to end up either in heaven or in hell for eternity. That's scary. That makes the matter urgent, and urgent in a way that nothing else is urgent in comparison. Reformation was urgent in a way that nothing else was urgent in comparison. That was what was going on in the later Middle Ages. That's why I refer to it as the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. And to simply talk about it being late medieval reform is a denigration of the urgency that was experienced, that is evidenced in the sources themselves. And the sources themselves, they use the term reformatio. That was the crisis of the later Middle Ages. We'll see further dimensions of it, manifestations of it, aspects of it in the coming lectures for the next several weeks until we get to a new departure, which was also in the context of this same apocalyptic expectation that had really begun with this late medieval crisis in the 14th century when the riders of the apocalypse had been unleashed on Christendom. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.